Oh, there we go. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Stranzel and I serve as the Director of Policy for New York City Department of Education's Office of School Culture, Climate, and Wellbeing. I am honored and excited to be here today to talk to you about Strong Resilient NYC, which is our city's initiative to implement social emotional learning assessment. And I'm going to invite my colleagues to introduce themselves before we get started.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Gallagher. I am the Senior Director for Capacity Building at the Office of School Climate, Culture, and Wellbeing. And I'll hand over to Julie.
Thank you. Julie Mchedlishvili, Senior Director of Social Emotional Learning Integration, New York City Department of Education. And I will pass it over to Paul.
Hi, everyone. Partnership and Implementations Manager. I'll mostly be working behind the scenes, so you won't see me on camera, but I'll be working the slides. And also, if you have any questions or anything that any question that you might have, you can put it into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll have a section for Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Paul. We can go to our next slide. So thank you, everyone. We're going to jump in. Today's objectives are on the screen, beginning with a goal to build awareness of what the Strong Resilient NYC initiative is, what it's all about, to share some of our lessons learned from implementation in what is the largest school district in the United States, and to unpack the multiple layers that go into implementing something of this magnitude at scale for the first time. So we're excited to jump in. So before we get into the details of how we did it, I want to ground us in why we chose to implement social emotional learning assessment. And really first, it was a means to be responsive to the moment. We all know too well the significant trauma, loss, grief, and challenges that our young people and adults and communities have endured over the past 2 years and few months in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, in response to recent attention on longstanding racial injustice, in response to the economic implications of the pandemic. And we knew that we could not reopen school in the same way that we had in the past. We knew that we wanted a mechanism to understand our children's social and emotional wellness and their well-being, and to understand the social and emotional skills that they were bringing into the classroom. Our goal was to assess their social and emotional competencies, to identify their strengths so that we could build on those strengths, and so that we could think strategically around how to address areas for growth and to continue to develop student needs. And so our goal was to assess their competencies, their strengths, and to think more strategically about our interventions and our supports, knowing that social and emotional skills can be a proactive protective mechanism that supports general wellness and well-being, especially during a challenging time. And just as a note, before we even considered the idea of assessment, we dramatically increased our staffing capacity, expanding our SEL programs, created a significant volume of trauma responsive and healing centered resources for schools. So when we talk about being responsive to the moment, the choice to implement a social emotional learning assessment was one piece of being responsive, but it was certainly not the whole picture. And another important reason why we introduced a social emotional assessment is that, to be honest, even if the COVID-19 pandemic had never happened, assessment was really a natural progression for us, given the work that we had been doing in social and emotional learning over the past several years. So in the 3 to 5 years leading up to the pandemic, there had been a dramatic expansion in social and emotional programming from as early childhood all the way through high school, significant investments in staffing of social workers, counselors, and mental health supports, introduction of the concept of social emotional learning and academic integration. And so assessment really presented an opportunity for us to take that work to the next level. And just as we would utilize academic assessment to inform high quality core instruction, assessment of social and emotional skills presents an opportunity to strengthen the instruction and community building and all of the related work that we do around social emotional learning every single day. And ultimately, the screener is just that. It's a tool. It's a tool to help schools and our entire school system as a whole advance a multi-tiered system of social and emotional support that provides foundational SEL skill building for all students, and then layers additional support for young people as they need more. So that's some of our big picture around the why, and then I'll transition us into what was actually the kind of the on-the-ground goal that we were looking to accomplish. We move to our next slide. Thank you. So what was our goal? The big picture objective, like I said, was to utilize the screener as a tool to advance a multi-tiered system of support for social emotional learning. The practical on the ground goal was for every single school to administer a social emotional assessment for every single student. And that meant nearly 1,800 schools and nearly 1 million students in a system of our size. And the goal is not just to administer the screener just because it's not to diagnose, it's not to label, it's not to exclude, but to connect with young people, to identify the strengths that they have, and to be able to make data-informed decisions around how we're supporting their continued growth. This goal and this initiative, this was an absolutely unprecedented initiative with an extremely ambitious timeline. Other districts in the country have implemented screeners or social emotional assessment on a smaller scale or over a longer period of time. And we did engage some of those districts and schools to learn from their experience. But ultimately, this was new territory. And not only had our system never used a social emotional learning assessment, we were still navigating a pandemic, and we're tackling issues of mindset, systems, logistics, technology, privacy and confidentiality, family engagement, and so on, and so many things that we'll get into today. So it was a tremendous lift, but the goal was clear and the value of the work was clear. So that allowed us to stay focused. And as we'll discuss a little bit later, we worked closely with the Urban Assembly, who had implemented social emotional learning assessment on a smaller scale and was able to advise us around policy and practice recommendations. So we're going to transition now to looking actually at the assessment itself, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues to talk a little bit about the work on the ground. So what assessment did we use? Why did we choose it? After a review of available tools in the field and after a formal negotiated service process, we chose to use the DESA, the Devereaux Student Strengths Assessment. The most important consideration in our process was that the tool we selected and the manner in which we went about utilizing assessment would align to the anti-racist and strengths-based values that were deeply embedded in the social emotional learning work that predated the assessment. So DESA is an exclusively strengths-based tool that aligns to the CASEL competencies. And as you can see from the slide, the skills that are assessed are non-clinical. It's strengths-based framing, and it reflects skills that students would demonstrate throughout the natural course of everyday learning. So completing tasks, resolving disagreements, actively participating in learning. These are the nature of the questions that teachers are responding to. And as you can see, it's non-clinical and non-diagnostic, really a strengths-based instrument to uplift what we know is valuable and positive and successful about our young people, and then continue to help them grow in areas where they need a little more support. So that was huge. The values and the framing, the alignment to CASEL were critical for us in the process of selecting a tool. And also there were a lot of logistical benefits. The ease of completion, the access to an online portal, immediate access to scoring information, the alignment of score categories to existing, social emotional learning programs that our schools were using, which were CASEL aligned, the time it takes to complete it. So the average completion time was around 2.5 minutes per student. And we partnered with our labor unions to ensure that staff were given adequate time to complete not only professional learning, but also to complete the assessment itself. And just one final note to mention here before we move on is around who completes it. So there is a student self-assessment version. However, our first year of implementation was adult administration only, where an adult who knew the student well completed the tool. And it's not something that adults are doing with the student. It's something that the adult completes on their own about the young person, using knowledge and information that they have observed about the young person in minimally 4 weeks of working with them, if not longer. When we introduced the assessment, schools were completing it anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks after the start of the school year to ensure that they knew students well enough to implement it thoughtfully. And we also empowered school leaders to make a determination around which adult completes the assessment for which student to ensure that they knew students well. And just last thing on this, because this really is crucially important, is we all, in addition to the flexibility of who completes the instrument, we also did not administer the assessment for any students with attendance below 50%, because we wanted to ensure that adults had adequate time to thoughtfully be responding. We wanted to minimize bias or risk of error that could result from really not knowing young people well. So there was a lot of consideration around the values of the tool, the orientation. Does this align to our programming? Does this align to what we're trying to do with social emotional learning generally? Is it easy to use? You know, there were just a lot of reasons why this really worked for us and has been successful in helping us to integrate the tool into the SEL work that we're already doing. And I'm going to take us through one more aspect and then turn the mic over. And that's really the most important part, which is everything that comes after the assessment. So in order to ensure that the DESA can be used as a tool to advance a multi-tiered system of support, the work really starts after you've administered the assessment. So to support schools with that, we created a resource called I Screened, Now What? And it guides schools, school staff members, district staff, support staff through 6 steps that are critical to ensuring that the data is utilized thoughtfully and that the assessment is not just for the sake of completing the assessment, but actually that young people have access to supportive services and interventions as a result of the administration of the tool. And so this includes, like, step 1 is analyzing data at the classroom level, grade level, systems level to look at big picture strengths and areas of need so that we can strengthen the foundational support that's provided to all students. Next is figuring out a system for sharing information with families, which we're going to get more into that later. After that is incorporating student voice and engaging students in the process of goal setting and reflection and how to build their skills. Also, schools did a lot of really meaningful work around for any student for whom their composite score was in the area of need range, they were referred to a school's personnel team, school-based problem-solving team, or a comparable teaming structure where a team of social workers, counselors, teachers would analyze the DESA data, gather more information, and make a determination to say, is additional support warranted? And if it is, you know, implement small group or individual interventions to support continued skill building. And then in all cases, both with school-wide interventions as well as individual and small group interventions, implement systems for progress monitoring and continuous improvement so that we're working through the same type of data cycles and improvement cycles that we know schools are very familiar with on the academic side. So that's a little bit about kind of how we got started, why we chose the DESA, what some of our framing was around why we would use an assessment tool, how did we envision it benefiting students and schools, and I'm excited to turn the mic over to my colleagues to share a little more details about what it actually looked like on the ground.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So definitely we couldn't do it all alone. Few of us sitting in the office, so we needed to build capacity across the system and engage many stakeholders in this work. One of the main first things that we did is that we asked every school to identify from 2 to 4 social emotional learning leads to lead this work at the school and become an expert. Those leads completed 13 hours of asynchronous training to familiarize themselves with the administration process and what to do after students were rated and after data was collected. In other words, after we screened, what are we doing next? How we integrate social emotional learning, what Elizabeth has been just talking about. In addition, every school member who was involved in the rating process, not just the teachers, but everybody who rating the students, and we actually recommended for everybody at the school to complete the asynchronous 1-hour familiarization training. So parent coordinators, school aides, definitely assistant principals, even and on top of every teacher or the person who knows the student well, we also try to encourage schools to ensure that every staff member can speak of it and understand what it works. Every district identified from 1 to 2 points along the borough's central support offices, which also identified at least 2 points to support the schools. Those are the people who are school facing, as we call them. They are meeting with schools on a regular basis, so they are people to go to, and they will have answers and be able to support the schools, not with the administrative process, but also what to do with data after all. Aperture, our support program that worked on DESA, provided technical assistance and organized the help desk. In addition, we created landing pages for internal resources focusing on content and process, and external pages for families and communities. But mostly important, to provide our on-site support and supplement professional learning, we've partnered with Urban Assembly to ensure smooth implementation and the follow-up work. 14 social emotional learning specialists across the entire city, all 5 boroughs, provided professional learning, held office hours, engaged in school visit. Even now, when we go to schools, they talk about the schools talk about how grateful they are to their daily support and just being a phone call away, a visit away from USL specialists who do this work. They can talk about this much better than I do. So I would like to invite Erica Allen, UASEL specialist supporting Brooklyn schools, and Raina Brew, UASEL specialist supporting the schools in the Bronx, to share their experience with the school support structure.
Thank you, Julie, for the introduction. As one of the many Urban Assembly social emotional learning specialists, as Julie mentioned, specifically supporting Bronx schools alongside my partner, Jessica, in my role as a specialist, my support is really customized as much as is feasible for the school's needs. Considering that every school community is in a different place in their SEL journey, my support really varies. But to give you a few of the examples of the ways I support, schools are through professional learning sessions, office hours, one-on-one session, and in-person school visits. In addition, I meet with schools and assist them with analyzing data, figuring the trends, and being a thought partner or sounding board. I have assisted schools in connecting the dots between curriculum and school needs, as well as facilitating train-the-trainer sessions so that school staff really feel knowledgeable in turnkeying the information. To support the Bronx schools as a whole, we also work closely with our BCO points, our district points, and superintendents. I am excited to be a part of the largest initiative across the country, and I am going to turn it to my fellow colleague, Erica Allen.
Thank you so much, Raina. You know, a lot of the work that I'm doing with Brooklyn schools is very similar to what Raina was saying. So the few things that I'll say that, so that we're not repeating each other, definitely we've had the opportunity to visit schools and really see SEL in action in the different spaces throughout schools. And because we're able to see all of the schools across our borough, it's been really helpful to elevate the promising practices that we're seeing in schools and sharing with each other just the things that are happening around New York City so that the great work isn't kept in a silo and people can build off of what they're seeing that works in schools around them. Another thing that I think was really powerful is with one of the districts within Brooklyn North, District 13, we did a professional learning community where admin from the different schools in the district were meeting together monthly with myself and the Deputy Director of Social Emotional Learning, Josh, at monthly virtual meetings where we were really digging into the principles of high quality SEL together, problem solving together. They would bring different challenges to the space, share with each other things that are working well, encourage each other. And it was a really great community of really being able to share what is working well and how to continue pushing forward the high quality work that's happening. So that's something that we're definitely looking forward to do with more districts throughout this initiative starting next year. And it's just been really encouraging to see the work that's happening.
Great, thank you guys. We very much appreciate your insight and your support in this endeavor. It's a huge endeavor. And as you've heard, we are the largest school district in the country. And with that comes a multitude of considerations when we're scaling up a project of this size. So one of the things we have to really consider with anything of this magnitude are the systems and the structures that we put in place to build the capacity of a system that is supporting almost 1 million students. So we have 47 districts, and one of the things we did very strategically was ask each of those districts to identify an SEL screener point person. And so in addition to the ongoing communications and professional learning, these point people meet with me twice a month to do a multitude of things. We're unpacking data, we're discussing upcoming workflows and timelines, and importantly, we're elevating shared experiences across the larger group, but also in breakout sessions and smaller group settings, maybe by high schools, maybe by middle schools, maybe by borough, so that we're building a collective, an individual and a collective knowledge and capacity of the work. So this really has helped us build that knowledge across the system, and it ensured that 97% of eligible students who could be screened were actually screened by the deadline, which was early December. And ultimately, once that screening occurred, and we've talked about this a little bit, we want to make sure that the students receive the interventions, the supports, the work that is necessary for them to build and strengthen their social and emotional and academic behaviors and skills. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you to one of those district points, Ms. Sheila Roberts, and Sheila works in District 31, which exclusively serves Staten Island, about 71 schools. And the District 31 superintendent and Sheila have both really, to our team, we're so proud of them. They've demonstrated an exemplary commitment to the work. And so Sheila, I'm going to hand over to you to discuss some of the work that you've engaged in and how you feel the systems and supports that we've built have helped you as the district point in turn support your schools.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share how we at the district work in support of the SEL initiatives. And we really could never have done any of this work without the support of Andrew's team. One of the things, my role at the district is an administrative role. I work on our superintendent's team for the largest district in New York City. So you can only imagine the amount of work that is entailed. But one of the things that we recognized early on is how understanding language screener, how important that is to our schools, how that would impact how they in turn move into training their teachers, as well as obtaining strategies to support students. So our BCO and our supports from the Central Andrews team has been pivotal to helping us unpack language, disaggregate the data, to really narrow it down for each individual school. So that has been so supportive. In addition, what we recognize that with every initiative that comes through, we have to see it through the lens of the school leadership as well as the students' faces. So it was so wonderful to notice how the SEL, after taking SEL assessments, how the strategies were being implemented in the classrooms, where teachers were able to identify that the students' need for improvement in specific strategies and align it to classroom level instructional supports. We have one of our schools, PS 60, that was featured in our citywide newsletter, showcasing the work and the strengths of utilizing the DESA screeners, as well as how it has sharpened their lens for instruction and enabled their students to really become more astute with understanding who they are in the space of learning. So just the collaborative efforts with Andrew's team and the district support, we've able to see changes in the lives of our individual students. And so we're looking forward to next year to see how we can grow our language and our supports in our schools. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. So I'm going to zoom us out even further and offer some insight into the type of coordination and support that we organize at the central or system-wide level. So at the central level, when we think about central office staff, and this is a lot of the folks who lead social emotional learning programming for the whole city, the most important functions for us, besides oversight of the initiative and the implementation, logistics, and tech support, was really helping central staff to make meaning of the bigger picture. So helping schools not just understand what is the DESA, but understand what are the implications of that for their own work. So where and how do they see their work with SEL intersecting with use of the DESA? What does it mean for the work they've been doing prior to introducing the assessments? What is the story or the narrative that we're weaving together about how these pieces fit that we will also use to walk schools through the intersection? Because although implementation of the assessment was new for our system, we wanted to be very careful to avoid the trap or the myth of thinking, oh, this is the latest thing, let's scrap everything we were doing before, now we're going to do this instead. And actually it was the opposite. The foundation that was built in those previous 3 to 5 and on years is how we're going to make meaning of the DESA. Because if you don't have any systems for building social emotional learning, you're not using any programming, you're not embedding it into instruction, then what use is the DESA to you? So there's a very natural and integrated relationship that social emotional learning programming has to the use of the assessment. And so for all of our office leaders who are leading programs like Harmony, restorative practices, community schools, health education, really wanting them to understand, okay, so how does the DESA fit into the work that I'm doing? How is this a value add? And how am I incorporating this into my work moving forward, so that schools and districts are not experiencing it like, oh, well, Raina's coming to my school to talk to me about the DESA, but Julie's going to come and talk about restorative practices, and then Elizabeth is going to come and talk about health education. And these are all 3 different conversations that we're having. Really want to understand how those things are integrated, how we meaningfully incorporate it into our work, and then how we're really clear and consistent in ensuring that that is clear when we are supporting schools. In a system of our size, we see so many initiatives come and go, and so the success of anything that we do as a system is contingent on our ability to build coherence and clearly articulate that vision. And then moving beyond just a conceptual understanding. So now what, right? Like, yeah, okay, they can understand how it's connected. They're assessing the skills that are taught by these various programs, but what does that actually mean that they're doing, and what are we doing to move central folks towards action as it relates to support? So I'm going to share a few of the things that we did. This is not an exhaustive list, but one of the things that we did is that there's a monthly professional learning community on multi-tiered systems of support that one of our offices facilitates for groups of schools throughout our city. And so we partnered with them to co-facilitate some of the sessions and started unpacking the DESA data as like a reference point and an exemplar as they're thinking through how they are supporting schools with teaming, infrastructure, and database decision making, and all of these elements of MTSS. It's actually like merging the work streams, using DESA as a real life example, looking at real school data, so that they then are equipped to support schools with like, yeah, okay, we've been talking about database decision making. This is actually what it looks like, and here's an example. We did a lot of work around crosswalks. So Harmony is one of our leading providers of social emotional learning support for elementary school students. And so there's a crosswalk between the programmatic components of Harmony and the areas that are assessed by the DESA, so that if I am a school that's deeply involved in the implementation of Harmony, and I'm using this lesson and this lesson and this lesson, I can start to say, wait a minute, my DESA data indicated my students had real strengths here, but a real need for growth here. How am I pivoting my implementation of Harmony to reflect what I'm learning about their students and their needs? And so we did a lot of work there. We've done workshops on DESA data and assessment in partnership with our offices that support students in temporary housing, attending conferences, doing workshops with them. We facilitated several professional learning on transformative SEL and how to mitigate bias in implementation of the DESA in partnership with our Office of Equity and Access, who leads a lot of our implicit bias work. So there are many different offices that had touch points either directly or indirectly to the DESA, and essentially it was really, that was our biggest priority, to build awareness, to build coherence, and then take meaningful action in the direction of integrating, so that schools and districts and others are not like, okay, yeah, you know, I like the DESA, but it's just one extra thing, because it's not just one extra thing, and that's counterproductive to the goals that we had for schools. And I'm going to turn it back to Julie to share a little bit more about how that looked on the ground, how some of the schoolwork looked on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. When the first administration was over in December, it became clear that it's super important for us to see how the work is happening on the ground, to visit the schools and to find what are the most successful practices in implementation in order to build capacity, lift the promising practices, share knowledge. We need to know how the schools across the city have been doing this work, how successful they were in implementation of a DESA assessment, and what were the conditions for success in order to make this work meaningful. We visited, I think that by this point, close to 50 K-12 schools, where we had an amazing opportunity to learn what works and what made this implementation successful. I believe, and I'll speak for Andrew as well, that the biggest need that we realized is the norming that needs to exist among our schools, what social emotional academic integration is. Everything that Elizabeth talked about, the DESA assessment is not an add-on, it's not something in passing, but it's the belief how we can service all of our children the best. So what works the best? What are the conditions for success? What's needed for this work to be successful? Schools need to prioritize, or the schools that did it the best, they prioritized robust tier 1 social emotional learning instruction that was either done through a very well researched, evidence-based, developed advisory program, or as we saw in a lot of cases, successful integration into academic content of every lesson every day. In other words, going back to the idea that all learning is social emotional and social emotional learning is good teaching. All of this is layered with supports for tiers 2 and 3. When Elizabeth talked about MTSS, we're not just when students are being referred to tiers 2 and 3, they still continue their robust support. There is robust instruction in tier 1. All of that is only possible if schools leverage teaming structure for continuous improvement. After DESA administered, what are you doing next? You need your teams to decide what are the supports, interventions I needed, not just for individual students, but for your system and structures. What is anything that needs to be changed? Does anything need to be adjusted? Is there any particular strength that you need to capitalize on? And there is still a growth of the skill that systemically across the entire school you need to work on. Teams, in order to be successful, should engage in ongoing inquiry cycle that focuses on social, emotional, and academic development of all students. And schools must capitalize on existing family engagement structures to make parents and families their partners in this work, and not just bringing awareness to parents, but making them partners and owners in this. It does take a village, after all. I would like to invite a school SEL lead, Guillermina Cabayas, who is a social worker in Middle School 319 in the Bronx, to talk about how her school leverages team structures for implementation of DESA assessment.
Thank you, Julie, and welcome everyone. So thank you for the opportunity. When we saw the opportunity to integrate DESA to the program that we already had in place in the school for our social emotional, we have been implementing the Leader in Me as our social emotional standalone curriculum for about 5 years. So what we did was we integrated the DESA roll out and that there's a protocol into what we already had in place, not as an add-on, but integrated and aligned, not just to the team structure that we have that is very well defined and specific, but also aligning the curriculum and making sure that the lessons, the direct lessons were meaningful to address the competences and the students that were identified as a need. We continue to work throughout. We did not miss a beat in terms of restructuring anything. We just make sure that we spend a lot of time meeting and analyzing and making sure that everything was aligned and integrated, so the teachers didn't feel that there was something else that they have to do in addition to that. And it was seamless. The implementation and the rollout, it was very, very effective. We have 3 systems and 3 overarching teams that oversee everything that has to be in the happen with SEL in the building. However, within those teams, there are sub-teams that lead different work, including student teams. So we start with what we call the Lighthouse team, and my camera is like the Lighthouse team. And that Lighthouse team is the administration and the SEL leads and the council of social workers. And then from there, we have what we call a leadership team, a culture team, and an academic team. And those teams have very specific goals and objectives, and we plan our sessions for the year. So over the summer, we get together as a team and we plan how we're going to support our school community for the next year with activities for all the 3 components. The academic teams also addresses a lot of the academic and the achieved goals. The culture team, a lot of that has to do with creating an environment that is inviting and supportive to the students, not just socio-emotional, but in a physical environment in the building. And the leadership team supports the students in the development of opportunities for families, for staff, and for students to learn about the SEL direct lessons. So we provide all these opportunities as we go along across the board. And open for any questions. I know that it's a lot of information at once.
Thank you, Guillermina. We have a few minutes left, and there is a time if there's any particular specific questions, or on a larger scale, on a global scale, we welcome them.
Thanks, everyone. We do have one question that was answered, but I thought it would be good to address to everyone. So we had Megan who asked, "I loved hearing that you use a tool to identify strengths and then build on the strengths of the students. I'm wondering about the data being used to identify students to receive interventions. Are there interventions based on strengths or weaknesses from the data?" Elizabeth, do you wanna share the response that you shared?
Sure. I think some people may have even seen it because I incorrectly put it in the Q&A. I meant to send it back to Megan, but this is good for us to talk about with everyone. So it's a great question. Scoring in the area of need range triggers a referral to the pupil personnel team or comparable teaming structure, but it doesn't automatically mean that a young person might need an intervention. The screener is one quick tool, and a lot more information would be gathered as part of that decision-making process. So whatever is the referring team that the students are referred to might do classroom observations, speak to teachers, speak to families, speak to students, possibly administer a supplemental, more targeted assessment if that's part of their work as, social worker, counselor, or even community provider, really to gather more information and say, okay, this is what we learned from the DESA, but what is the full picture that we have come to understand about this young person? And then based on all of that information in aggregate, they would make a determination of, is an intervention actually warranted? Not every student whose composite score was in the area of need range will actually require a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. Some will, and for those who that does appear to be warranted based on the information that's gathered, the team would make a determination around what is the most appropriate intervention. And that is likely something that is targeting building skills and addressing areas of need, but that's not without affirming strengths and continuing to leverage strengths to grow, areas that are less developed. I think that points us back a little bit to the values that we talked about at the beginning about this being strengths-based, and our deep belief that young people come to us with tremendous social and emotional skills and competencies and potential. And a lot of those skills and competencies can be leveraged as part of an intervention that's targeting an area of need, so that young people are making progress in goal setting or responsible decision making, relationship skills, whatever is identified as their growth area, but we're not doing that absent what we know to be strong and successful about the other skills that they've developed. So it's a very individualized process. Obviously, you know, the DESA activates that process, but it's not the conclusion of the process. So many different factors are going into intervention decision making. And just one other thing I want to offer in that vein is that sometimes if schools had a really robust teaming structure and use of data before the DESA, then the students that are presenting with the composite score area of need may not be a surprise to schools, and many of them may already be plugged into interventions that are targeting those skill areas, in which case maybe you're routing back to think about what are we doing at the classroom level. There's not a need to automatically do a new intervention just because that's where a young person scored if there are already things that are in motion. Instead, you could consider, how am I leveraging this as a progress monitoring tool? How can I use this information to strengthen what I already have in place? And we do see that happening in a fair amount of schools.
Thank you. We have Truel, who asks, can you speak a little more about how the student voice was used to inform decisions? If anybody would like to address that.
I'm happy to start, others can jump in. So that varies depending on the age of the student, that varies depending on the school's, you know, preferences around implementation. In a lot of the urban assembly schools who were using the DESA before we launched the citywide initiative, they had very structured processes for student voice and engagement through like conferencing protocols, goal setting protocols, reflection sheets. And typically that work would happen through a structure like advisory or a homeroom, morning meeting, some type of space that already exists in the school where young people are building social emotional skills, building community, doing a lot of that personal development and SEL work. And so as part of the tools and resources that we created, which we spoke about, we provided schools with sample goal setting sheets, sample reflection sheets, sample discussion prompts, conversation guides, so that they could engage young people and do it in a positive, empowering way that affirms the strengths that young people have and invites them to participate in the decision making. Of course, that will vary based on whether or not schools have that kind of infrastructure like an advisory system. It will vary based on the ages of students. So the way that a 10th grader is able to engage in that type of exercise is going to be different than my own child who's in kindergarten when her teacher administered the DESA. So it depends on age, it depends on school structure, but those are some of the ways in which that work has been done, and we're looking forward to including that even more as we anticipate years 2 and 3 of the initiative and beyond.
And just to add to that, Elizabeth, I think that goes back to the teaming structures. Schools know when they have good, strong, robust structures, they know their students well, and they can help make those types of decisions of which tools, by which means students can engage in self-reflection are best for their students. So the heart of this, the anchor in this, is the teaming structures to help schools make those decisions for students. Absolutely.
I think we have time for maybe this one last question from Taylor. Have schools, especially those who may not have a strong tradition of data analysis, faced any challenges incorporating DESA scores into their programming and mission or vision? And are there supports available for these schools to improve this data analysis and integration?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think Julie and I experience this on a daily basis. We see every end of the spectrum. We see schools with the most robust, thoughtful, strategic teaming structures from the cabinet or ILT level all the way down to attendance teams and every teacher team in between, to schools that have not yet really thought about that, the importance of that, or the significance of teaming structures. So we are creating tools and systems and means by which we can support schools. We're leveraging the districts, we're leveraging the borough offices, we're looking at ways that our central team can support. But that is the benefit of us going into schools, that we're lifting that up, we're seeing it firsthand, and we're able to help direct or redirect some schools who do find that a challenge in that space, and hopefully give them the tools and the resources that they need. But yes, we have 1,800 schools, 1,700 schools. We have every end of the spectrum and everything in between. What this has done is really highlight the need, the importance of the need for teaming structures in schools and inquiry cycles. Absolutely. Julie, you want to add anything to that one? I think you'd agree.
We out of time. I just want to say to remind everybody that yeah, it was the life grade. Just to remind everybody that this is not just the data on individual students, it's the data for the school, for the leadership on systems and structures. And all data is good data. It's all about how you make decisions on utilizing and analyzing that data. So that was, I guess, the larger takeaway from this work.
100%.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.